The morning sun rose slowly over the Arizona desert, washing the cliffs in shades of crimson and gold. The air shimmered with heat even before noon, and a faint breeze carried the scent of juniper and dust through the valley. At the base of the red rock bluff sat a wide clearing where folding chairs had been arranged in two perfect rows, their white ribbons fluttering lazily. A small archway handmade from mesquite branches and wildflowers stood at the front. It wasn't a grand cathedral or a luxury venue. It was the land itself that blessed the union. Lena adjusted her veil in the soft reflection of a polished pickup window. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves but from the effort it took to steady herself. The wheelchair beneath her was sleek and silver, a gift from David that he'd built himself in his workshop. Every screw, every curve of the metal frame had been touched by his hands. It wasn't just a chair. It was a labor of love. She looked out across the field where the guests were gathering, a mix of family, townsfolk, and a few curious onlookers from nearby ranches. They were stringing paper lanterns, laughing, calling out greetings, and yet Lena could feel the edge of something fragile in the air. Some eyes lingered longer than they should have, and not with admiration but pity. Others whispered softly, the way people do when they don't understand how someone could be happy after losing something as essential as walking. But Lena had learned long ago that happiness wasn't something you stood on. It was something you built inside yourself. She took a deep breath and turned toward her maid of honor, Maria, who was fastening the last bit of lace around her bouquet. "You nervous?" Maria asked, forcing a grin that didn't quite hide the tears at the corners of her eyes. "Not anymore," Lena said. "He's waiting. That's all I need to know." Across the field, David was adjusting his tie, his long black hair tied neatly at the back of his neck. His mother, a small, dignified woman in a turquoise shawl, stood beside him whispering an Apache blessing under her breath. David had always been quiet, the sort of man who spoke with his eyes more than his mouth. When he met Lena in town 3 years earlier, she was fixing a flat tire by herself, refusing every offer of help. He had smiled at her stubbornness, and she had fallen in love with the man who admired her strength instead of pitying her for her chair. Today, that same strength held the day together. Every detail of the wedding, from the handmade arch to the stone path laid over the rough ground so her wheelchair could roll smoothly, was their joint creation. It was simple, but it was theirs. From a distance, a hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding over the red soil like a blessing from the ancestors. The drummers, 2 of David's cousins, began to beat softly on hide drums, their rhythm steady and patient. It echoed off the cliffs and returned like a heartbeat, slow, powerful, eternal. Guests began taking their seats. Children ran between the chairs, their laughter bright as the sunlight. Somewhere near the back, a group of men, out-of-town guests from David's cousin's workplace, arrived late, talking loudly and clinking bottles. Their laughter was sharp, careless, but for now it was lost in the desert's open expanse. Lena didn't notice them. She was too focused on the horizon, where the path curved toward the arch. Her father appeared there, his old cowboy hat in hand, tears shining on his weathered cheeks. He walked to her slowly, taking his place beside her wheelchair. "You ready, darlin'?" he asked, his voice catching. "I've been ready my whole life," she whispered. As the first notes of the flute began, the crowd stood. The wind moved through the wildflowers, bending them gently toward the bride as though the desert itself bowed in respect. Lena took hold of her wheels and began to move forward, each turn smooth and deliberate. The path was firm beneath her, lined with flat stones and petals of yellow marigold. The valley fell silent except for the soft roll of her wheels and the steady beat of the drums. The sunlight glinted off her veil, off the metal frame of her chair, and off the tears shining in David's eyes as he watched her come toward him. In that moment, no one saw a wheelchair. They saw a woman, radiant, unbroken, and powerful as the land around her. The music softened as Lena reached the archway, and the air hung thick with emotion. The guests' applause rippled like a gentle wind through the field. Even the hawk above seemed to pause in its slow circle, as though the desert itself were holding its breath. But not everyone felt the reverence of the moment. Near the back row, 3 men stood slightly apart from the rest of the crowd, outsiders, dressed too sharp for a country wedding. They were friends of Mark, David's distant cousin. who had invited them along more out of politeness than kinship. They wore matching smirks and sunglasses, even though the sun had already dipped behind the cliffs. Empty beer bottles rested in the grass near their boots, and one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Kyle, was already on his second flask. "Hell, look at that," Kyle muttered under his breath as Lena rolled up beside her father at the altar. Didn't think it was real. Thought Mark was kidding about the wheelchair. His friend Ray snorted. "Guess the honeymoon's gonna be interesting." He laughed quietly, elbowing the third man, Eddie, who was recording the ceremony on his phone with exaggerated seriousness. Eddie chuckled but didn't respond. Even he felt a flicker of unease, but he masked it with a crooked grin. "Man, people marry anyone these days," he said. "Guess love really is blind and, apparently can't walk either." Kyle let out a low whistle, shaking his head as if it were a tragedy rather than a mockery. "I mean, come on. She's pretty and all, but..." He trailed off, raising his eyebrows. "No way I'd sign up for that." Their laughter was muffled by the whisper of the wind, but not completely. A few nearby guests turned, their expressions tight with disapproval, though no one said anything. It was a wedding, after all. No one wanted to make a scene. Still, the whispers spread like a slow fire. People could feel it, the ugliness creeping into a day meant for beauty. Lena's mother, seated a few rows ahead, stiffened. She didn't know the source of the snickering, but she felt its sting. She glanced toward the back, her expression cold and sharp as a blade. Then she turned her gaze forward again, forcing herself to focus on her daughter, who was smiling at David as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them. David, standing tall and calm in his gray suit, sensed something shift in the air. He followed the faint sounds, the muffled laughter, the glint of a raised phone, but said nothing. Not yet. Behind the last row, a figure stood half in shadow, silent and still. Thomas, David's older brother, had arrived late from the reservation. He wore a simple dark vest, his long hair braided down his back, a string of turquoise beads around his wrist. His presence was quiet but commanding, the kind of silence that demanded respect. He caught the sound of Kyle's whisper. "Bet he has to carry her everywhere," and the muted laughter that followed. Thomas didn't move. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, stayed fixed on the men for a long moment. In the Apache way, silence could mean many things: patience, power, or warning. The men didn't know that. They didn't even notice him standing there, a shadow in the crowd, watching. At the altar, the officiant began to speak. His voice was deep and kind, recounting how love endures through storms, through trials, through pain. His words drifted over the crowd like a prayer, and Lena's hand found David's. Her smile was unguarded, luminous. But behind her, the laughter started again. Softer this time, but still cruel. Maria, her maid of honor, heard it and turned sharply, her eyes flashing. She saw the men smirking, saw one of them lift his phone again. For a moment she looked ready to march right back there and make them eat it. Then she caught sight of Thomas. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning either. He was simply watching. And when his gaze shifted, the laughter died mid-breath. Kyle lowered his phone, suddenly aware of the weight of the man's stare. Thomas said nothing. He didn't have to. The desert wind rose again, stirring dust around their boots, whispering like something ancient and unseen. The ceremony continued, but the air had changed. The men didn't know it yet, but they had already crossed a line, and the silent Apache had heard everything. The wedding carried on beneath the bruised orange sky, the last of the sunlight brushing the cliffs in strokes of copper and rose. The desert was beginning to cool, and a faint hush settled over the valley, the kind that comes only after long heat, when even the cicadas pause to breathe. Thomas stood near the back, unmoving. His shadow stretched long over the dry grass, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other loosely by his side. To anyone glancing his way, he looked calm, even detached. Just another guest standing quietly in the background. But those who knew him, who understood what silence meant in the Apache way, would have seen it for what it was: watchfulness. He had spent most of his life in silence. Years in the service had taught him to listen for the smallest sounds: the crunch of a boot before dawn, the flutter of wings in the dark, the rhythm of another man's breathing. Silence to Thomas wasn't emptiness. It was information. It was intent. Now, That same silence was wrapped tight around him, listening. Measuring, Kyle's voice reached him again. Low, mocking, slurred just enough to show he'd had one too many. Man, look at that guy, Kyle whispered, nodding toward David at the altar, marrying a woman in a chair. Must have lost a bet. His friends snorted, stifling laughter behind their hands. Thomas's gaze flicked up. Slow, deliberate. He didn't move his head, only his eyes. He studied the three of them. City men by the look of their shoes. Polished leather, dusty now. Their shirts were too crisp for the desert. The kind of men who wore confidence like armor but crumbled when faced with real strength. He could feel his pulse steady, each beat measured like the thump of a drum. To the side, Lena's father had caught the edge of the laughter too. He frowned but turned his attention back to his daughter, unwilling to sour her moment. Others noticed as well, guests shifting uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. It wasn't the place for confrontation, but Thomas wasn't like the others. He took a slow step forward, his boots silent on the packed red earth. The movement was unhurried, but it drew the faintest attention from those in the back row. A little girl sitting beside her mother looked up, her wide brown eyes following the tall man in the vest. She didn't know why, but she stopped fidgeting and sat still. The men didn't notice. They were too busy leaning close to whisper again, their laughter muffled by the music now playing softly as the officiant spoke. Thomas came closer, no more than a few paces behind them now. His shadow touched their boots, though they didn't realize it. He listened. Bet she gets front row parking everywhere, Ray muttered, grinning. Kyle chuckled. Man, you're terrible. Eddie started to say something but stopped. His gaze drifted sideways, catching sight of Thomas in his peripheral vision. He froze, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Thomas didn't look angry. His expression was unreadable, carved from stillness. But there was something in his eyes, something ancient, something that didn't need words to command silence. Eddie nudged Kyle slightly. Hey, someone's standing behind us. Kyle glanced back lazily, and for the first time his grin faltered. Thomas didn't move. He simply met Kyle's eyes with a calm so deep it was unsettling. His presence felt larger somehow, like the desert itself had taken human shape and was watching them, quietly deciding what to do. Kyle forced a smirk. What, you got a problem, old man? Thomas tilted his head just slightly, his voice a low murmur, smooth as gravel underwater. Not yet. There was no anger in his tone, no heat, no threat. Just quiet truth, the kind that carried weight. Kyle blinked, thrown off. He laughed awkwardly and turned back toward the ceremony, pretending it didn't bother him. But his shoulders stiffened, his laughter died, and suddenly the fun was gone. Thomas remained still. The sun had dropped behind the cliffs now, and the air cooled sharply. Shadows stretched longer, darker. He stayed there, behind them, silent, a sentinel. To the guests around him, he was nothing more than the groom's brother, standing respectfully at the edge of the crowd. But to those three men, though they didn't yet understand why, his presence felt like judgment. As the vows began and Lena's voice trembled with love and courage, Thomas's eyes never left the backs of their heads. He wasn't a man seeking conflict. He was a man guarding peace, and in doing so he had become the most dangerous kind of quiet. The silent Apache was watching. The vows had begun. The air shimmered in soft gold as the last light of day brushed the mesa. Lena's voice trembled slightly when she spoke, but her words were strong, every syllable carrying the weight of all she had endured and overcome. I don't need the world to stand for me, she said softly, her eyes never leaving David's. Because you've taught me that love doesn't rise or fall. It simply stays. The guests sighed as one, some blinking back tears, others smiling through them. The moment was fragile, sacred, but from the back of the gathering, that sacredness fractured, a muffled laugh, too loud to ignore. It came from Kyle. He'd been still for several minutes after Thomas's silent warning, but as the alcohol warmed his veins and the ceremony dragged on, the arrogance began to creep back in, the kind of arrogance born from ignorance, the kind that believes silence means submission. He leaned toward Ray, his voice low but not low enough. She doesn't need to stand, yeah, because she can't, he snorted, covering his grin behind a hand. Ray chuckled, glancing nervously toward the crowd. "Dude, chill," he hissed. "You saw that guy behind us, the big Indian statue? He ain't gonna do nothin'." Eddie shifted uncomfortably, glancing again at Thomas, who stood only a few feet behind them, unmoving. The fading light caught the faint silver of his hair braid, the gleam of the turquoise at his wrist. His expression hadn't changed, but something in the air around him had. The laughter of the wind seemed to die. Even the insects went quiet. Kyle didn't notice. He was already pulling out his phone again, the screen lighting up in the dimming dusk. He tilted it toward the altar, recording Lena and David as they exchanged vows. "Gonna post this later," he whispered. "Caption it, 'Till death or flat tires do us part.'" Ray barked out a sharp laugh but stopped halfway through when he realized how many heads had turned. The officiant hesitated mid-sentence. Lena looked up, her brow furrowing. She heard something, she wasn't sure what, but saw Maria's face tense beside her. Maria turned, furious. "You—" Before she could speak, a soft hand landed on her shoulder. Thomas, he didn't say a word. He just gave a slight shake of his head. "Not now." The ceremony resumed, though the hush was brittle now, like thin glass stretched too far. The guests could feel the tension, though most didn't know why. Kyle whispered again. "What's he gonna do, pray me to death?" The words were quiet, but Thomas heard them. He stepped forward once. Just once. It wasn't a threat. It was an inevitability. Eddie saw the movement first and elbowed Kyle sharply. "Stop," he muttered. "I'm serious, man, stop." Kyle turned halfway, lips curling into a smirk. "What, you scared of him?" Eddie didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence behind them was heavy enough to make the skin on the back of his neck prickle. When Kyle turned fully, Tomas was there. Close now, not looming, just present. The kind of presence that fills space without words. Tomas's voice, when it came, was low, steady, and colder than the wind that swept through the canyon. Enough. Just that one word, the kind of word that didn't need to be loud to be final. Kyle tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in his throat. There was something about the man's eyes, a calm that carried the weight of generations. David's mother, seated near the front, noticed Thomas's stance. Her lips curved into the faintest smile of recognition. The old ways, she thought, still have guardians. At the altar, the officiant was finishing the vows. David placed the ring on Lena's hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "In your strength," he whispered, "I found my home." The guests applauded. The sound washed across the field, breaking the tension. For a moment, all was well again, but Thomas's gaze never left the men at the back. Kyle's smirk had vanished, replaced by the uncertain shuffle of someone who's finally realized he isn't the biggest man in the room, or in the desert. Thomas said nothing more. He simply stood, hands loose at his sides as the applause faded and the wind whispered once again through the sage. The moment passed. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The silent Apache had stepped forward, and for the first time that evening the bullies felt the edge of a reckoning they couldn't name. The sun had finally slipped behind the western cliffs, and the desert glowed with that deep amber light that lives only for a few moments before dusk. The guests were rising from their seats, applauding as the newly married couple sealed their vows with a kiss. The sound carried like birds taking flight, bright, fleeting, beautiful. Lena's father leaned down to kiss his daughter's cheek. "You did it, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with pride. She smiled, eyes shimmering. "We did." David took her hand, and together they turned toward the crowd, the arch of wildflowers framing them like a doorway into something new. The music swelled, drums and flute woven with the soft pluck of a guitar. It should have been a perfect ending, but not far from the edge of the clearing the three men were still there. Kyle clapped mockingly, slow and deliberate. "Ah," he drawled, "true love rolls on." His laugh came out sharp and ugly, cutting through the applause. Several guests turned, startled. Even the musicians faltered for a beat. Ray muttered under his breath, "Man, shut up." But Kyle wasn't done. He'd drunk too much, felt too invincible, and he couldn't stand being ignored. "Hey," he shouted louder this time, waving his phone in the air. "Let's get a group picture with the bride. We'll call it Wheelin' and Dealin'." The laughter that followed wasn't shared. It fell flat, bouncing off the silence that spread through the crowd. Lena froze, Her hand tightened around David's. David's jaw flexed. He didn't move yet, not because he was afraid, but because he was choosing. The Apache way was to weigh one's words before giving them to the wind. Before he could step forward, Thomas did. He moved like a shadow, quiet and unhurried, every step measured. The guests parted instinctively. The drummers went still. Even the air seemed to draw back as if it knew what was coming. Thomas stopped a few feet from Kyle, his boots planted firmly in the dust. The fading light caught the lines of his face, carved with years of wind and war, patience and loss. His voice when it came was calm and low, carrying farther than a shout ever could. "Stop." Kyle turned, his grin uncertain now. "Hey, relax, man." "It's a joke." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "You're laughing at something sacred." Kyle blinked. "Sacred? It's a wedding." "Yes." Thomas's eyes didn't waver. "A promise between two souls. You mock it. You mock her. And by doing that," he took one step closer, his tone steady, "you mock yourself." The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. Ray swallowed hard, stepping back. "Hey, he didn't mean nothing." Thomas looked at him, and that was enough. The man went silent. Lena's mother, standing now at the front, placed a hand over her heart. She knew that tone, not anger but authority. The voice of a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Thomas's gaze drifted back to Kyle. "You don't understand what you tried to break here." "But you will," Kyle scoffed, trying to reclaim his bravado. "Look, I said it was a joke. No harm done." Thomas nodded slowly. "No harm done, and yet." The quiet that followed was vast, the kind that made even the wind pause to listen. Then Thomas turned his head, speaking over his shoulder without looking at anyone in particular. "This day is for them. Don't let it become something ugly." David finally stepped forward then, his hand still linked with Lena's. His voice matched his brother's, calm, unshaken. "We'll take it from here." Thomas gave a small nod and stepped aside. Kyle, unsure what had just happened, gave a half laugh and muttered something to his friends. But no one was laughing anymore, not even them. Their jokes felt small now, their laughter hollow against the desert silence. The drums began again, slow and solemn. The musicians picked up the melody, tentative at first, then stronger. The celebration continued, but beneath the surface, the air vibrated with unspoken tension. The bullies tried to blend back into the crowd, but everywhere they turned, eyes followed them, cold, steady, wordless. Thomas didn't need to say another thing. His warning had landed. The calm had returned, but deep down everyone felt it, and the storm hadn't passed. It had only been told to wait, and when it came, it would be quiet, swift, and unforgettable. The light was almost gone now. The sky had shifted from gold to violet, and the first stars were appearing above the mesas. A cooling wind swept through the valley, rustling the dry grass and the wildflowers along the path. The music had started again, softer this time, slower, but the rhythm felt uncertain, as if even the drummers were holding their breath. Lena and David had begun their slow procession down the aisle together, smiling at their guests, accepting quiet congratulations as they passed. But near the back, the tension still hung like smoke that refused to lift. The laughter had died, but the shame lingered. Kyle and his friend stood awkwardly now, unsure where to look. The crowd's warmth had turned cold around them, a silent judgment that weighed heavier than words. They should have left it there. But pride is a foolish thing. Kyle couldn't stand being invisible. "Come on, man," he muttered to Ray, trying to sound casual. "We didn't do anything wrong. These people are just uptight." Ray didn't answer. He kept glancing at Thomas, who still stood only a few feet away, motionless. The last glow of daylight caught his face, outlining his calm like a mask of stone. Finally, Kyle said it louder. Too loud. "Hey, don't look at me like that. I said it was a joke." The crowd turned again. The music faltered. Lena stopped her chair halfway down the aisle. The pedals crushed softly beneath her wheels. David turned too, his hand finding her shoulder, his eyes fixed on the man who wouldn't stop. Thomas stepped forward once more. No hurry, no anger, just purpose. He stopped a few steps from Kyle, his shadow long across the earth. His voice came low, not raised, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You think a joke makes it lighter?" he said. "But words are stones. You throw them and they hit what you can't see." Kyle frowned, uncertain. "Man, I said I was sorry." Thomas lifted a hand slightly and the man fell silent. You mocked a woman's body, a body that has carried more strength than yours ever will. You mocked her spirit, which has done what your pride cannot. It stood back up after falling. The words didn't come like a scolding. They came like a prayer, steady, patient, deliberate. You see her wheels and think weakness, Tomas continued, his voice now carrying through the still air. But you forget. The strongest trees grow twisted from the wind. You forget that a warrior's worth isn't in his legs or his arms, but in what he stands for. No one moved. The only sound was the wind shifting through the dry grass and the low hum of the drums fading to silence. Thomas's eyes locked on Kyle's. You mocked a warrior's bride, he said. You mocked what you don't understand. In our way, that's a debt you don't want to owe. Kyle swallowed hard. His bravado cracked. Look, I didn't mean... Tomas took one more step forward, his tone still calm but colder now, like flint ready to strike. When you mock what's sacred, the desert remembers. The wind carries your words farther than you ever meant them to go. Someday you'll need kindness and you'll pray it finds you. Remember this moment when it doesn't. The silence that followed was absolute. The crowd was still, their eyes glistening, some in awe, some in shame. Kyle opened his mouth, then closed it again. Whatever defense he'd meant to give dissolved in his throat. Thomas stepped back then, breaking the tension like smoke scattering in the wind. This is a day of love, he said quietly. Don't stain it any further. And then he turned away. David's mother bowed her head. A few elders in the crowd whispered prayers in Apache, soft rhythmic words that rose into the cooling evening air like blessings. Lena exhaled, her fingers gripping David's hand. He didn't yell, she whispered. He didn't have to, David nodded. He never does. The drums began again. Their rhythm deeper now, slower, heavier, like a heartbeat returning after a long pause. As Thomas walked back to his place beside his brother, no one dared to speak. The warning had been given, and for the first time that night, the bullies felt small, smaller than the stones under their feet, smaller than the silence that surrounded them, because they finally understood what true power looked like. Not rage, not noise, but the unbreakable calm of a man who needed neither. The silent Apache had spoken. The last notes of the drum faded into the desert air, their echo stretching between the cliffs like the breath of something ancient. The guests stood frozen in a quiet reverence that had nothing to do with fear. It was respect, deep and wordless, for what they had just witnessed. The moment had weight. Lena's eyes followed Thomas as he turned away from the men and began to walk slowly toward the edge of the clearing. His movements were deliberate, every step measured, as if he were walking between two worlds, one of peace and one of judgment. Behind him, the three men stood pale and uncertain. The alcohol that had once made them bold now seemed to curdle in their veins. They looked around for support, for laughter to join their own, but there was none. The crowd that had once been only politely attentive was now united against them in silence. David took Lena's hand and wheeled her toward the front again, trying to restore the joy to the evening. But everyone could feel it. Something unfinished lingered in the air. Thomas stopped a few feet from the bullies, the desert wind tugging gently at his vest. He didn't look at them this time. He bent down instead, picked up something small from the dust. A phone, one of theirs, dropped in the confusion. Its screen was still lit. A faint video played, the earlier mockery caught from their own hands. Lena rolling down the aisle. The whispered jokes. The laughter. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Thomas watched for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, he closed his hand around the phone and crushed it. The plastic cracked, the glass shattered, the light went out. The sound, sharp and final, was louder than any shout could have been. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Not from fear, but from awe. Thomas didn't look angry. He didn't even look at the men. He simply turned the broken pieces in his palm, the shards glittering like tiny mirrors in the fading light. He said quietly, "You built your laughter on her pain. You thought it made you strong, but strength doesn't break things, it builds them." He let the pieces fall to the dirt. The fragments landed softly among the sage and wildflowers. Technology remembers what the heart should not, Thomas continued, his voice steady, carrying through the air. It traps cruelty and calls it humor. But here, he looked up toward the cliffs, the land remembers better. It holds the truth longer than your screens ever will. Kyle stepped forward, his face red. Man, that's my phone. Thomas finally looked at him. His gaze was level, not threatening, but it hit like a weight. Then it held your shame, he said. And now it doesn't. Kyle's mouth opened, then closed again. He didn't know what to say. No one did. Somewhere near the front, Lena's mother started clapping. Just once, in a slow and firm. Then another joined her. And another. The sound spread until the whole valley echoed with applause. Not for humiliation. Not for revenge. But for justice done with dignity. David turned to his brother and met his eyes. There was pride there, but also something deeper. Gratitude. Lena blinked hard to keep from crying. He didn't raise his voice, she whispered to her husband. He just showed them, David nodded. That's how he was taught. The applause died down slowly, replaced by a soft hum as the musicians found the courage to begin again. The melody rose, gentle, soothing, carrying the desert back toward peace. Thomas walked past the three men who now stood with their heads bowed. He didn't speak to them again. There was nothing left to say. The lesson had already been written, not in words, but in silence, in crushed glass, in the echo of a broken phone and a broken pride. As he reached Lena and David, Thomas gave a single nod. Go celebrate, he said quietly. The desert has heard enough. And with that, he turned toward the darkening horizon, where the stars had begun to spill across the sky. Behind him, laughter returned, but this time it was pure. It came from the heart, from joy, from love that had endured mockery and come out stronger. The lesson had begun and ended in one quiet act, a reminder that power spoken loudly is noise, but power held in silence, that's truth. The valley glowed beneath the deepening twilight, painted in shades of rose and indigo. Lanterns flickered to life one by one, strung along the edges of the clearing like captured stars. The wind had gentled now, carrying the faint scent of juniper and sage through the crowd. For a long while after Thomas's act, the wedding had been silent, not the uneasy silence of tension, but the reverent quiet that follows a prayer. People were still processing what they'd witnessed. It wasn't violence. It wasn't vengeance. It was something rarer, a lesson wrapped in dignity. Then slowly the world began to move again. The musicians picked up a tender rhythm on their guitars and flutes, and the guests, still subdued, turned their attention back toward the bride and groom. Lena sat at the center of it all, radiant under the lantern light, her veil brushing against her shoulders, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But they weren't tears of hurt anymore. They were of release. She had heard everything earlier, the laughter, the mocking whispers, the cruel video. She had pretended not to for the sake of her wedding, but every word had landed. For a while she'd felt the weight of pity pressing down on her again, the same pity she'd fought for years. Now, watching Thomas walk back through the clearing, calm as the dusk itself, she felt something stir in her chest. Strength, not borrowed from him, but remembered in herself. David knelt beside her, resting his hand gently on her arm. You don't have to say anything, he murmured, but she shook her head. Yes, I do. The music stopped. The crowd fell silent again as Lena turned her wheelchair toward the men at the back. They stood awkwardly now, surrounded by stares, uncertain where to look. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, almost gentle. You wanted to laugh at me, she said, and I suppose I can't stop you. You see the chair and you think it means I've lost something. But I didn't lose who I am. I didn't lose my joy. I didn't lose my worth. Her words carried farther than she realized. Even the wind seemed to still to hear her. She lifted her chin. I lost the use of my legs. That's true. But you know what I found? I found out who would stay when others left. I found out how to keep moving when standing wasn't an option. And today... She looked toward David, her smile soft and bright. I found someone who sees me. Not what I sit in. A murmur of quiet approval rippled through the guests. Lena's gaze drifted back to the men. You tried to make me small with your jokes, but you can't shrink someone who's already made peace with herself. Her tone didn't accuse. It simply was. A truth laid bare. Kyle, who had been staring at the ground, looked up just long enough to meet her eyes, and immediately looked down again. Lena nodded once, then wheeled herself back toward the arch of flowers where she and David had exchanged vows. The crowd, moved by something beyond words, began to applaud again. It wasn't loud or wild. It was steady, heartfelt, the sound of respect. Maria, standing beside the arch, was crying openly now. "That's my girl," she whispered. Tomas, watching from the edge of the clearing, allowed himself the faintest smile. He didn't step forward or speak again. He didn't need to. The bride had finished what he'd begun. David leaned close to his wife, his voice low. "You didn't just stand up to them," he said softly. "You stood up for everyone who's ever been looked down on." Lena laughed quietly through her tears. "Guess I stood up after all." The crowd erupted. Cheers this time, laughter that was free and warm. The musicians struck up a lively tune, the drums beating again like a heartbeat restored. As the lanterns swayed above them and the desert night deepened, Lena felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Complete. Not because the bullies were silenced, but because she had spoken her truth and the desert had listened. The music swelled again, low and rhythmic, the kind that feels like a heartbeat under the earth. The stars had come out fully now, scattered across the desert sky like ancient witnesses. Lanterns glowed warm along the stone path, casting golden halos across the faces of those gathered, faces that were no longer marked by pity or unease, but by quiet reverence. Lena sat beside David at the head of the clearing, her veil now draped over the back of her chair. The glow of the lantern light shimmered across her wedding dress like soft fire. Around them, people were beginning to breathe again, to talk, to smile. The heaviness that had hung in the air had lifted, replaced by something lighter, something whole. The bullies stood near the edge of the crowd, awkward and small. The noise of the celebration didn't include them anymore. Their laughter had been replaced by silence. Not the calm silence of Thomas, but the uncomfortable quiet of men who finally realized the cost of their words. Thomas had returned to his place near the arch, his posture easy, his expression unreadable. He didn't bask in the moment or in what he'd done. He simply stood, hands clasped loosely in front of him, watching his brother and his new sister-in-law with a kind of protective stillness. Then, as the music softened again and the officiant raised his voice to bless the union one final time, Thomas began to move. He walked toward Lena and David, and slow, steady, as though each step carried meaning. The crowd parted instinctively, making room for him. The sound of the drums faded, leaving only the whisper of wind and the creak of the lantern swaying overhead. Tomas stopped in front of Lena. For a moment he said nothing. The silence around them deepened, rich and expectant. Then he spoke to me softly, but with a weight that filled the night. "Do you know what my grandmother used to say?" He began, his gaze shifting between Lena and David. "She said that standing is not about your legs. It's about your spirit. Some people walk their whole lives and never once stand for anything. But some," his eyes met Lena's, "some can't walk at all, yet they rise higher than the rest." A hush spread through the crowd. Even the wind seemed to pause to listen. Thomas turned then, looking toward the back of the clearing, toward the three men who had spent the day turning laughter into cruelty. His voice didn't change. It remained calm, steady, quiet. "Now you've seen what standing really looks like," he said. The words fell like stones into still water, soft at first, but rippling outward, echoing through every heart in that valley. Kyle dropped his gaze, shame flooding his face. Ray put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that was part apology, part acknowledgement of the lesson they'd both just received. Tomas didn't wait for a response. He turned back to Lena and bowed his head slightly, not a gesture of authority but of respect. "You have our people's blessing," he said. "You walked through fire today and you came out shining." Lena's voice trembled when she answered. "Thank you. For everything." Tomas smiled faintly. "You don't owe me thanks. The desert does what it must to remind us who we are." He turned then, stepping away from the circle of lantern light and into the dark beyond. His boots made no sound on the sand. For a moment his silhouette was framed by the glow behind him, tall, still, resolute. And then he was part of the night again, a shadow among shadows. The guests began to talk softly, to laugh again. The music returned, the drummers tapping out a rhythm that pulsed with life. Lena and David kissed once more under the arch, and the crowd cheered, not just for their love, but for what they all had witnessed. Grace stronger than mockery, silence stronger than noise. Far in the distance, the hawk that had circled earlier called out once, its cry echoing down the canyon. Some said later it was a coincidence. Others swore it was an omen, the spirit of the land answering back. But to those who were there, the meaning was clear. The silent Apache had spoken, and the desert itself had listened. The night had fully embraced the valley, and the desert sky was a blanket of stars. Lanterns hung like captured fireflies, glowing warmly along the aisle and the edges of the clearing. The air smelled of sage and dust, cooled now from the sun's heat, carrying the faint sweet scent of wildflowers. The wind whispered gently as if it were joining in the celebration. The tension from earlier had finally dissolved, replaced by a deep, steady warmth. Guests were smiling again, chatting softly, their laughter light and genuine. The musicians struck up a lively melody, flute, guitar, and drums, the rhythm bright and jubilant. Lena's wheels rolled smoothly over the stone path, each turn confident and deliberate. She was no longer moving through a field of judgment, but through one of love and respect. She reached David's side at the front, their hands entwined. The officiant smiled at them, his expression softening. "You've weathered the winds of life already," he said. "May your love continue to grow stronger than any storm." Cheers rose from the crowd. Children ran between the chairs again, chasing each other under the lantern light. The desert seemed alive, as if every tree, every stone, every shadow was celebrating alongside them. Even the bullies, Kyle, Ray, and Eddie, had retreated to the edges, their earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet shame. They were no longer the center of attention. The power that had fueled their mockery had been stripped away without violence, leaving only the clarity of their smallness. No one jeered. No one spoke. They were witnesses to a day larger than themselves, a lesson they could not unlearn. David leaned closer to Lena and whispered, "You were incredible." She smiled, brushing back a strand of hair. "So were you," she replied, "and so was he." She nodded toward Thomas, who stood quietly at the edge of the celebration, a silent sentinel. The drummers changed tempo, inviting everyone to dance. Some of the older guests hesitated, but the energy was contagious. Soon, couples and families were moving in circles, their laughter mixing with the music. Lena's chair spun lightly to the rhythm, David moving alongside her, their joy undeniable. Tomas didn't join the dance. He didn't need to. His presence was felt in every step, every laugh, every smile that dared to rise stronger than the fear that had hovered earlier. Guests looked at him with quiet admiration, understanding that the peace and celebration they enjoyed were in part because of his vigilance. Not loud, not showy, but unwavering. Lena paused for a moment, looking around the clearing. She saw friends and family dancing, children running, elders clapping, and the three men who had mocked her shrinking quietly into the background. Her chest swelled with gratitude. She realized that the day wasn't only about love between her and David. It was about resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of standing firm in one's truth. The hawk, which had circled the cliffs all day, called out again, echoing across the canyon. Its cry seemed almost celebratory, as though the desert itself approved. Lena raised her head and laughed, pure and unrestrained. David joined her, spinning her gently to the rhythm of the drums. Guests clapped along, the music soaring under the starry sky. The wedding, once threatened by mockery and scorn, had transformed into a testament to courage, to love, and to the strength found in silence. The silent Apache had spoken, but the bride had lived it. Together they had reclaimed the night, and nothing could diminish it. As the stars sparkled overhead and the lanterns cast a warm glow on faces alight with joy, Lena realized something profound. This was not just the start of a marriage, but the celebration of a spirit that could not be mocked, a love that could not be broken, and a lesson that would linger in the valley long after the music ended. And so the wedding continued. Not as a fragile moment in time, but as a living story of love, strength, and the quiet triumph of truth over cruelty. The desert held it all, as it always does, enduring, unwavering, and eternal.